Welcome to Pathways to Partnership, the podcast powered by MoveAmerica. Here, we explore the intersection of industry, government, and academia, where collaboration sparks innovation and strengthens our nation's defense industrial base. Each episode will bring you thought-provoking discussions, expert insights, and real-world success stories that showcase the pathways to building a stronger, more innovative defense industry. And now, here's your host, Rick from MoveAmerica.
Today, we're going to take a deep dive into one of the most pressing issues of our time, securing America's lifelines through building resilience in our critical supply chains. We're going to be talking with Duane Wilson, MoveAmerica's Director of Business Intelligence, Assessments, and Advanced Computing. He's got over 2 decades of experience in cybersecurity and defense. So whether you're a business leader, a policymaker, or simply someone who wants to understand the hidden infrastructure that powers our daily lives, this episode is going to give you insights into why supply chain resilience isn't just a business issue, it's a national security imperative. Let's get started. Duane, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well. How about yourself, Rick?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for joining us. We are thrilled to have you and thrilled to talk about this topic. Duane and I are just going to have a great conversation, and hopefully you're going to learn something. We're going to start off with me asking, it's one of those things where when I was a journalist, I always wanted to have things spelled out for me. So what do you mean when we're talking about critical supply chains, and why are they considered such lifelines for our nation?
What are critical supply chains? So basically, they're the behind the scenes systems that make modern life work. So computer chips, meds, defense gear, rare minerals, all the good stuff that we consume on a day-to-day basis. If one of these breaks, and this is where the critical part comes, suddenly you can't buy a car. As you all know, I'm very avid in switching my cars every 2 years. I haven't been able to do that recently. Your asthma inhaler or some other medical device that you're relying upon, or your country's missile defense system won't work or won't have the supplies that it needs. So it's kind of like Wi-Fi for the nation. It's invisible, but if it's down, everyone panics and everyone knows.
You really have to think of it like oxygen, right? You don't know that you're not getting enough until it's no longer there, and you're struggling to breathe. And we as a society really have grown very dependent, particularly on our technology. A lot of people don't realize the different things that go into technology that come from all over different parts of the world. You're talking about the rare earth elements. These are things that are used in technology, they're used in other applications, and they're really only found in certain parts of the world.
That's completely accurate. And we'll talk about some of the countries that we are both in partnership with and heavily reliant on. That could be a good thing when everything is good with those relationships, and could be a negative thing when relationships are strained in some form or fashion.
Yeah, and then you're also talking about the ripple effect. And I think that's the thing that, again, a lot of people forget. It's that analogy where when a pebble drops into some very still water, just surrounding the pebble drop isn't where you're gonna have the problem. It's all of the waves crashing to the shore, right? So it's one chain reaction after another.
Yeah, so we have what's called tiers of suppliers, right? So you have your suppliers that you are immediately dependent on, and they might have suppliers that they're dependent on for certain subcomponent parts to what they're manufacturing for you. And so, yeah, it's definitely a ripple effect when any link in that particular chain is broken, as well as the effects of that.
Now, you and I both used to work with Project Spectrum, the Department of Defense Cybersecurity Initiative, and we always used to say during our trainings with Project Spectrum that the supply chain is constantly under attack. So we know all about cyber threats, but there are plenty of other threats. What are some of the biggest current threats other than cyber that are really hitting the supply chain?
Sure. So obviously, cyber is kind of my bread and butter, my background. Since 2002, I've been supporting the DoD in various aspects of cyber protection. Geopolitical is one of the major areas that is threatening our supply chains. So I like to affectionately call geopolitics as world drama. And so it makes supplies very dicey, or in some situations inaccessible. as we'll look at a few examples shortly. And then manufacturing. Lean manufacturing means there's no plan B when stuff hits the fan. And that's one of the things that we want to raise awareness for in this particular. You can be proactive, just like you can as it pertains to a cyber threat. You can be proactive in understanding the environment and the climate around your supply chain so that you can mitigate some of these threats. So cyber, geopolitical, and economic. And we say just-in-time systems. These are systems that don't store supplies that you need, but will procure those supplies in an ad hoc fashion as you need them. And so these are vulnerable to what we call shocks, which are similar to the shock wave. The impact of that can be catastrophic if you're heavily dependent on those particular supplies.
And then going back to cyber, because I said I know that that's your bread and butter. Always used to be just about ransomware, but now I understand there's a lot more going on when it comes to cyber attacks. It's no longer just ransomware. There's a new thing called extortionware. I mean, can you go into some of the ways that businesses within the supply chain are getting attacked and what their bad actors or the threat actors end game is with that?
So one of the things that we were discussing, I had a conversation with Cybersecurity Center of Excellence last week, was that cyber is really not a technology problem or an infrastructure or networking problem, as we likened it to in the past. It's really a business problem, right? So things that actually impact your bottom line. And ultimately, since 2002, when I got into cyber, 1988, I think was the first recorded cyber attack called the Moore's Worm, which wasn't supply chain specific, but its impact was no less felt throughout the community that was leveraging those resources. Really, what it boils down to is people are really the weakest link in any supply chain, right? Because we're the ones that are actually leveraging technology. We're the ones that are consuming the products that are being produced via various supply chains and things of that nature. So there's many different wares, I call them. So there's this spyware, there's ransomware, there's adware. So anything that you could wear, for lack of a better way to say it, can become a cyber threat. But really, we're concerned about things that will impact either your business operations or, in the case of the DoD, the lives of our soldiers that are fighting these great fights.
No, absolutely. It is all about the warfighter. It's always about making sure we're protecting them and we're giving them the best weapons ever. Our executive director, Earl Wyatt, gave a brilliant quote that I still use to this day when I was talking to him a couple of months ago, where he said, "I never want to be in a fair fight. I, I always want the advantage." And that's exactly how we look at it when it comes to DoD. And when we're talking about these supply chain disruptions, I think one of the biggest ones we've seen probably in the past couple of years was the Colonial Pipeline attack, right?
That occurred in 2020. So, in layman's terms, a hacker gang, they basically were able to get access to our gasoline infrastructure. And so, this is a classic case where gas was available, right? You could still go to the pump, but it was inaccessible because of a digital attack, right? And so they compromised the infrastructure that was used to gain access to a critical resource like gas. And I've heard people compare it to 2020, right, during COVID, where things like toilet paper or toothpaste were supplies that were in high demand simply because of how ubiquitous that virus impacted the world.
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the real reasons why MoveAmerica has really tried to help strengthen and bolster the defense industrial base and especially the domestic supply chain, because we learned during the pandemic just how much we relied on other areas and other countries for these products that once the supply chain disruptions were in there, we said if this was manufactured domestically, we wouldn't be having these problems. And so now it's really all about making sure that, again, we're working very hard to get businesses domestically to produce so that we don't need to rely on other areas as much.
We call it nearshoring our supply chain, which is basically bringing the manufacturing ability, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, I believe, back home. And that's as critical as some of these infrastructure components that we're talking about.
And then after talking about Colonial Pipeline, the global chip shortage, because again, this is another area where, like you said, the nearshoring, we're trying to bring chip production here because obviously this was something that we found the chip shortage was just leaving a lot of industries vulnerable.
Yeah, and so near and dear to my heart. So no chips equals no cars, no new cars, no new iPhones, which no fun to someone like me. And I know many of us like our gadgets. And so because of the shortage, it wasn't even similar to Colonial Pipeline where the gas prices were rising. We just weren't able to produce the technology. And because our technology is so dependent on these chips manufacturers being able to get their supplies at a low cost. And we're still feeling the impacts of this global chip shortage even now.
Yeah, and you have to think there were a lot of manufacturers that were scrambling during that time.
Mhm.
I even remember stories about the automotive industry printing 3D parts that they couldn't get because they would normally get them from other parts of the world. And now, of course, you're seeing a lot of those automobiles with those 3D printed parts. Those 3D printed parts weren't exactly the same specifications as the parts that would
Yep.
normally go in there. And so you're seeing a lot of recalls, you're seeing a lot of vehicles that are having malfunctions and issues. So, I mean, it really does show, like you said, that ripple effect where one shortage leads to another shortage, leads to another shortage, leads to another problem.
Yep. And then the compensation, there's no such thing as free, right? As you know, I'm on travel and I'm in a hotel. And it's always funny when you get to the room and they have two water bottles or two or three water bottles there. And they say, these are free waters. And I'm like, no, it's not free. I actually paid to stay at the hotel. They're included in the price.
Right.
And
If they had
so
free water,
that's kind
people
of
would
how
be walking in off the street.
so there's no free lunch. The compensation that these manufacturers had to make in order to make their bottom lines keep, continue to meet their profit targets and keep their stock prices high. We're going to pay for it down the road.
Now, when you're talking about paying, again, tariffs have been a big thing where, tariffs
Mhm.
have been in the news lately and everything. And a lot of people were not really understanding how tariffs were going to affect things because I don't think people really understand just how dependent the United States is on foreign suppliers for critical materials like
Yep.
semiconductors or rare earth elements. If you had to put a number to it, how dependent are we?
So I'll answer it this way because it was cheaper until it wasn't, right? So we offshored basically like a lot of the hard stuff, like chip making, and now we're sweating every time Taiwan basically catches a cold in the proverbial sense. China, as we talked about earlier, makes most of the world's rare earth materials. So we gave up our seat at the manufacturing table. Now we're clawing to get it back. These countries are not the problem, but they control a lot of what we need. When they sneeze, the entire supply chain catches the flu. Very complicated because they're both, in the case of China, they're a supplier as well as a political partner, but they're also a rival as well. And so these are some of the data points that we were able to collect related to those two countries that I mentioned before. And so we estimate that that puts our country at a 70% strategic risk of losing access to supplies that we need during times of crisis.
And yeah, and so explain that a little bit more because when we say a 70% strategic risk, does that mean like 70% of our domestic supply chain is affected by these other countries?
Uh, yes, yeah, basically. So what we define basically as critical at the beginning of the webinar, uh, the subset of that is where we basically came up with this particular number uh, in those critical areas. And
Right.
so why we have such good uh, cost associated with goods that we consume on a regular basis is because we're able to manufacture them so cheaply, and even with the cost of import uh, prior to all of these tariffs, as you mentioned, we're still able to domestically produce uh, these things that we deem as critical because of those relationships and those partnerships. And so it's a heavy dependency.
And, I have to think we talk about China and rare earth processing, but
Mhm.
China is a supplier of a lot of different things, but that's not the only part they play in when it comes to our supply chain, right?
Correct. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're also they're a strategic partner, and being in the computer science field, after a certain level of education, uh, we were just talking about it before the webinar started. Uh, all I saw basically in my classrooms were people from Asia and people from China specifically, and people from India, and so definitely was in the minority from that perspective. And so uh, they are as educated, if not more, and they're also consuming our education as well. Uh, and so they're dual hatted in that perspective. So from a role perspective, right? So because of all that, they're a major supplier, right? They're a strategic competitor, right? And they've done that in such an elegant way. Uh, so they have resource control, right? If they want to stop producing or stop partnering with the United States in some forms or fashions. And so basically, as the United States, what we're calling for is just more balance. And we'll talk about the CHIPS Act and the Defense Production Act, some of these policies that have been passed in the case of the DPA 75 plus years ago to bring back some of these capabilities to the United States. It's very imbalanced right now, and China is not the only one that we can talk about from that perspective.
No, and that's the thing. We're pointing to China as an example. We
Sure.
also we do want to make sure that everybody understands that this sort of thing comes from all different corners. And one of the things that we've always talked about when it comes to the defense industrial base and cybersecurity is the protection of intellectual property. Because what a lot of companies don't realize is disrupting your business is one thing, and that's what some threat actors will try to do. But the other main goal is the theft of intellectual property, because if they can get their hands on it, they can either produce it themselves and then offer you competition, or they can discredit it. We've seen that with several defense contractors over the years that had intellectual property stolen, where somebody would come out and say, well, we're developing this system, but it doesn't really work. And so then it really puts a US company at a disadvantage that was trying to develop that proprietary information, because now, even if they were to develop it, you're going to have that seed of doubt at the beginning.
Yeah, and you've heard the phrase, "Can we all just get along?" And I think it's incumbent upon the United States, China. We talked about Taiwan and other countries to see the value of collaboration in certain ways. Because for me, you can disincentivize. I think I'm making up a word. I could do that, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, disincentivize people from actually stealing if they feel like they're part of the process, right? And part of the innovation in the case of manufacturing things that are novel. And I think you see that a lot in our academic institutions, as I mentioned. And I think there's tremendous value in that. Having grown up in my early years of life on a university campus, I saw the value of diversity in that perspective. I know that's not a word that's popular, but what I'm talking about is innovation, innovative diversity is what I'm specifying as a means to mitigate the risk of intellectual property theft.
Thanks, Duane, for that fascinating and eye-opening conversation about the critical vulnerabilities in America's supply chains. This is clearly a complex topic that deserves deeper exploration. In an upcoming episode, we'll dive even deeper into specific solutions, emerging technologies, and practical strategies for building supply chain resilience. Thanks for joining us on Pathways to Partnership. If you found this episode valuable, please make sure you subscribe and share it with others who need to understand these critical issues. Until next time, remember, the strongest chains are built one link at a time.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. The views expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily represent the views or positions of MoveAmerica or its affiliates. Always consult with a qualified professional for advice specific to your circumstances. For more information about MoveAmerica and our mission to strengthen the defense industrial base through innovation and collaboration, visit us at www.moveamerica.org. Thank you for tuning in to Pathways to Partnership, powered by MoveAmerica. Until next time, stay inspired, stay innovative, and we'll speak with you soon.